Thank you for joining us today for the ISR Insights Speaker Series. The Insights Speaker Series is a forum for ISR faculty to share their research to inform the public good. A full schedule of Insights talks is available at the ISR website at isr.umich.edu, as well as recordings of past talks in the series. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Noah Webster. Dr. Webster is an associate research scientist in the Life Course Development Program in the Survey Research Center at ISR. His research focuses on the bidirectional influences of health, health-related behaviors, and social relationships, as well as the role of environmental and social contexts in shaping health disparities across the life course. Today, he will present recent research that explores the unique impact of diverse environmental types and explores the implications of multiple intersecting environments, as well as the potential of these occurrences to address pressing societal changes. We'll have time at the end for Q&A. Please enjoy this presentation. I'll turn things over to Dr. Webster.
Thank you for the introduction, Catherine. And I'd also like to thank the ISR Director's Office for the invitation to present today. Today I'm going to be talking about some of my work that focuses on the intersection of the social, natural, and built environments. So just a brief overview of my talk today. So I'll start off with some very brief background, and then I'll move right into 3 study highlights, focusing on different intersections of, again, the social, natural, and built environments, with the first one focusing on social networks or relationships in lower income senior housing communities. The second one is an intersection of all 3 aspects, where a project where I worked on where we looked at the impact of bioretention or rain gardens on the interactions that neighbors have with each other in Detroit. And the third project I'll highlight today is a focus on social capital for the purposes of watershed dam management here in the Huron River. First, for some very brief background about environmental context. So what we know is that environments are multidimensional. So listed here are 3 types of ways that environments vary, and this is not an exhaustive list, but 3 dimensions that environments have include their social dimension. That could include, for example, the relationships that we have with people, the ties we have with them, or other aspects such as trust we have of people in our community or another geography. Environments also include the built structures around us. So think of this as the constructed aspects of our environments. And this could include, for example, an apartment building or the sidewalks, or in some cases in the projects I'm going to highlight today, the water infrastructure that moves our water after a heavy rainstorm in the street. And the third environmental context I'll highlight in some of my work today is the natural environment. And this can vary widely and includes things such as the climate or the weather. It also includes severe weather events that we've been seeing more and more of as climate change accelerates. This can also include things such as green space, such as our access to parks or places to walk with vegetation. And what we know about environmental context is that it is very important for shaping our access to resources. This includes, for example, access to economic resources or health-related resources if we think about who's in our social network and who provides information. Or in terms of access to green space, that could be viewed as a health-related resource because it provides opportunity for physical activity. And lastly, we know that environments provide access to social capital. So you might see so right now there's some intersection right here between the 2 categories. So we know that social is a type of an environment, but it also the other types of environments that we're exposed to and have access to shape our access to social capital. So again, the intersection between these multiple dimensions of environmental context. So we've noticed that more research is needed at the micro neighborhood scale. So this includes the street block level landscape. So often a lot of research occurs at the census tract levels or with other areas that people define as neighborhoods. But what we're missing is an understanding of how that block level environment that we live on impacts our lives in important ways. And also we need more research at the housing community level. So this includes the apartment buildings or the communities in which people live. And the specific project I'll be highlighting today focuses on a specific type of housing community, and that's for older adults with lower incomes. And lastly, we need more research that helps to seek to understand the implications for both prevention and intervention in terms of the role of the environment. So as I noted, a lot of the research focuses on unique and different aspects of the environment or environmental context and how it shapes our lives in important ways. But what's missing from this work is seeking to understand how the intersections of these multiple types of environmental contexts might impact our lives. We argue that by focusing on these intersections, we could have an opportunity to address pressing societal challenges that are currently facing us. And this includes, for example, sedentary behavior or the need to become more physically active. Also, social isolation, a problem that became acutely many people became acutely aware of during the COVID-19 pandemic, but many segments of our population were experiencing this much before the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, climate change, arguing that the intersection of these three aspects of environment can provide unique solutions to address this pressing issue. So the first study I'll be talking about today is an intersection between two aspects of environmental context, particularly the social and the built aspects. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on this project, Tony Antonucci, also here at ISR, and Neil Alexander at Michigan Medicine. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this work was made possible by support from multiple agencies, including the MacArthur Foundation, located internally here in the University of Michigan, the Pepper Center, and also Mishar. And lastly, this project was made possible by a grant from the National Institute on Aging. So as I noted, this project first is an intersection between two aspects of environmental context, and in particular the intersection between the built environment, or an apartment housing community, and social networks within the community. And in this particular project, we are looking at how the intersection between these two aspects of environmental context are related to or can help shape quality of life of the residents living in lower income senior housing communities. And we looked at, in particular in this project, their health outcomes, their satisfaction with their community, and also the potential to influence physical activity at the intersection of both the social and the built environment.
So in terms of our social relationships, what do we know about them? So we know a lot. We know specifically that they're linked to a whole host of health outcomes, including our longevity. So a meta-analysis has shown that social relationships, or access to good social relationships and not being socially isolated, is more beneficial for long life and longevity than not smoking or exercise. So it's up there in terms of its ability to impact our health and live long, healthy lives. Social relationships, we know, are also impacted by health behaviors. So for example, who we interact with, their health behaviors might affect and influence how we engage in health behaviors. This is through a number of different health mechanisms and theories, which I'll cover in a second. We also know that social relationships vary across contexts. So I alluded to this earlier, that social relationships are influenced by the physical structures that we encounter. Like think about our workspace in your hallways that might influence which pathway you might walk every day and whose office you might pass by, and how often that influences whether or not and how often you talk to them, just as an example. We also know that social relationships are multidimensional. That is, we can describe them in terms of their structure. That would be like the number of people that you feel close and important to, for example. That would be an example of network size or a structure of your social network. And social networks and relationships can also vary in terms of their composition. So think about your social network and who you would value or think about as being close and important to you. And who are those people? Is it a mix of friends, family, other people, coworkers, etc.? And these relationships also vary in terms of their quality. Some are positive, some are negative. Some can be both positive and negative at the same time. Think about your own relationships and some of the people who help and support you on a daily basis who might also get on your nerves from now and then or annoy you or make too many demands. So that's what we mean when we talk about and think about relationships in terms of their quality. So what we don't know, and we need more research on as it relates to the social environment and social relationships more specifically, is how is the links to health, the link between social relationships and health, shaped by environmental context, such as in this case that I'm highlighting, the housing context in which older adults are living. Then also we need more research on how to incorporate this increasing body of literature about the impact and the value of social relationships, many of which there's a large literature before COVID, but COVID spurred a new generation of research on the impact of social isolation or the impact of social relationships on mental health, on well-being, and physical function, etc. But how do we incorporate this into interventions to make change in people's lives? So that's an increasingly hot topic in the area of social relations and health. But also, what are the specific aspects of social relations? Because I highlighted these are multidimensional. But what are the specific aspects that we need to incorporate into interventions to make the most impactful change on, for example, people's health behaviors? Is it the structure? Is it the composition? Is it the quality, et cetera? So we need more research to delve into those specific avenues. So now to zoom in on the specific built environmental context that I'm looking at in this study highlight. So it's, as I mentioned, it's lower income housing for older adults. And another word for these is called affordable senior housing communities. And there's many of them in Ann Arbor and around the area. So these are subsidized by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So typically there's an age restriction on these types of communities. Another word for them, it's called a specific program within HUD called Section 202, in which people have to be over the age of 62 to live in these communities. And there's sometimes younger people living in these communities if they qualify if they're on disability support. Typically what these apartment buildings are is a congregate living setting. So think about them as a multi-unit apartment complex. And they vary widely in terms of their architecture structure. So if you walked by one, you might not readily know that it is a HUD subsidized Section 202 site, or in other words, an affordable housing community, unless you saw a sign or you went in or you knew about the community. So these architecture varies, as I mentioned. They could range from low rises, so like a 3-story building, to high rises up to like 13, 14 floors with multiple towers. And some of them have multiple entrances. Some congregate housing also has detached units where they're more like townhomes, where everybody comes and goes out of their own door. And as we think about the architectural setting, we might think about too how that influences social interactions. And that's a different set of research I've been doing too, to understand how if you have your own door in and out of your lower income senior housing unit versus if you come and go out of the same door, kind of like we do here at ISR, might that impact our relationships with our co-residents in this case? And then also the amount of staff, services, and programming varies widely across these communities, even though they're all under the broad umbrella of lower income senior housing. So for example, many of these communities have what's called a service coordinator who is on site to provide and connect the residents to services in the community and on site. But also there's much variation in terms of the physical activity programming, for example, or the meals and different services in the community that are brought in. So one theoretical perspective that has guided this work that we've been doing in lower income senior housing as it relates to social relationships is social contagion theory. And this theory argues that behaviors are contagious, much like would be an illness like the flu or COVID. And it argues that behaviors spread through our social relationships or our social networks through 3 primary mechanisms, with the first one being what's called induction effects. This is where a person has certain influence or prestige in a network, where given that location or that prestige, others engage in those behaviors as a result of that person's influence, and therefore behaviors might spread the network through that mechanism. Another one is proximity effects. So if we think about an apartment building or a housing complex, this would be people who might share close proximity to each other. So for example, people who are on the same floor and they pass by each other, more likely to see each other. Are they more likely to engage in the same behaviors or physical activity or share information about health-related information? The last mechanism I want to highlight is called homophily. This is the idea that people associate with others who have similar characteristics. So you might have heard the phrase "birds of a feather flock together." So this is what this concept is based on. So thinking that people in a housing community might more likely to interact with one another or form relationships based on people with similar interests, and those interests might fall along the lines of health behaviors. So for example, people who are interested in exercising in the community might be more likely to join together to form a walking group. And the social contagion has been linked to a whole host of negative health outcomes, including obesity and smoking, for example. So the first research question we sought to answer in this study was, are social relationships among residents living in affordable senior housing associated with A, their overall satisfaction with their living environment, that's their apartment building, their housing community, and B, their overall functional health? So the data come from a study we call the MAC House study for short. And this was a study led by Tony Antonucci here at ISR and also Bob Kahn. And it involved residents who were living in 3 affordable senior housing communities in Southern California. And the average income in these communities was $23,000 for a single person and $26,000 for a couple. And again, it's based on standard of living in California. And in 2012 and 13, we conducted baseline surveys and conducted follow-up assessments with a group in 2014. And at the heart of this was an intervention where 2 of the communities were involved in a successful aging intervention, as you can imagine, with the involvement of both Tony and Bob. But then we also collected these assessments with a control community. So we pooled the data for this particular analysis and study. So we had 210 participants overall across the 3 communities with an 80% response rate of residents, which we thought was pretty excellent given we also had people on site working with us as part of this project. And at the follow-up time point, we had a 75% follow-up for an N of 157. So I won't spend much time on this, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of study sample characteristics. The first being on average, these residents were aged about 74. and 76% of them were female. And as you can see from the number of years that people lived in the community, there's quite a wide range of variation. Because that's often a question I get is, well, depending on how long people live there, might that influence their social connections? And I say, yes, absolutely. Because the residents who are there the longest, like for example, we see greater than 5 years, we have just a third of the population. So more of a chance to get to know your residents, but also turnover that's happening in these communities could influence the amount of ties that are being developed and formed. Then also I wanted to highlight too, the percentage that are married is very low. Only 10% of them were married in these three communities. So in terms of the measures that I want to zero in on, the first one is overall satisfaction with the community that you're living in. Again, think about that as the physical built structure. That's the housing community. So we asked the residents at both time 1, the baseline, and the follow-up at time 2, overall, how satisfied are you with blank? So we named the specific community they lived in. We asked this on a 5-point Likert scale. And as you can see, people were overall pretty satisfied with their senior living housing environment. And this was pretty stable across the year and a half in between when we measured this. We also asked a question, not a super in-depth question, because again, this was a successful aging intervention. We had to ask a whole host of other questions, but we were able to get a single question in the survey and study where we asked, how many of your relationships with other residents here at this community are good relationships? And we asked this on a 5-point scale, ranging from none of my relationships are good to all of them are good. And as you can see, overall, this was pretty high, where respondents had an average of 4. So that's on that scale. It's most of my relationships with other residents are good. And we only asked that in the time 2. Tried to get in time 1, but there wasn't enough space. But fortunately, we were able to get this item on the survey at that second time point. In terms of the health measure we looked at, I'm focusing on, in particular, on functional health limitations, because that is a big concern in lower income senior housing, because these communities are what's viewed as independent living. You might have often heard of what's called assisted living or memory care and things like that, where you might need in-home nursing. But these communities, by regulation, require the individual to be able to live independently on their own. It doesn't mean they can't receive services in their home. It doesn't mean they can't have a caregiver living with them, but it means that they should be able to live independently on their own. So often residents might hide or mask difficulties they're having in terms of living on their own, their daily activities of living. So we thought this was an important measure, but thinking in particular, how can the fellow residents be involved in shaping whether or not a person is able to independently live on their own in this community? Because having people live longer in their homes, in particular in the setting, is beneficial for everybody, all the way up from society, because it reduces Medicaid costs, it reduces just the well-being for the individuals as well. So we asked a single question was, does your health limit your social activities? Again, on a 5-point scale from not at all to I could not do my usual activities. So a higher score indicates more functional health limitations. And as we see here, a significant increase in functional health limitations over time among this group, which indicated that the intervention could have done more work and need more tweaking to prevent the functional limitations, but there is potential for the social relationships we'll get to in a second. So shown here is a regression analysis in which we predicted first the overall satisfaction with the community. And this is the change in this outcome from time 1 to time 2. And we looked at a range of predictors in terms of its association with this change in this overall satisfaction with the community. So we looked at satisfaction with your specific apartment unit, satisfaction with the transportation that is provided by this community, satisfaction with the meals that are provided here, satisfaction with the staff and the help that you get from staff, satisfaction with how much influence you as an individual have on the community, and lastly, how much the number of good ties that you have with other residents. And I circled it in yellow, not just because that's the topic I'm interested in, but I wanted to highlight because it's one of the most strongest effects we found was that residents who had more good relationships with other residents reported a significant increase in their overall satisfaction with their housing community over time. We see that some of the other factors did matter. So how satisfied you are with your apartment matters, and also the satisfaction with staff and support. But really one of the strongest correlates of your satisfaction with your living environment was how many of the good relationships you had with those others who are occupying that same space. Now, in terms of that functional health outcome, so the change in functional health limitations over time, it really was only the number of good ties that you had with other residents that mattered in terms of that change. And we see it in the direction that we hypothesized. So residents who reported more good relationships with other residents in the building, in the community, reported a decline in their functional health limitations. This is important because, again, as you saw on average, the whole sample, there was a significant increase. But among those who had more good ties with other residents experienced a decline. So to us, this highlighted the potential and the power of social relations in this particular housing context and built environment. So a couple things I wanted to highlight based on us being there in these communities in the context of this intervention, and some anecdotal evidence we heard was that program participation, because again, I mentioned at the heart of this was a successful aging intervention. So when we visited the community, some residents would come up to us and say, this is wonderful. We need this program. We need this intervention. How can I be involved? How can I help get other residents involved? But then at the same time, some other residents would pull us aside and say, I saw you talking with so-and-so. That was interesting. Because if they're going to be involved in this, there's no way am I going to be involved with this. So key us into a key insight that there is an interesting social dynamic going on in this housing community, in this built environment. And we need to be keenly aware of that as we think about intervening, because if we just pursued ahead and just involved those volunteers with their enthusiasm, which is great, we need that, but we might alienate a whole section of the community by involving those specific persons. So this led to our second question, which is on a second pilot study that we did, which is, can we systematically identify a group of socially engaged residents, in other words, those with large numbers of ties to other residents in the community, who we could then potentially involve in a future health behavior intervention, for example, a physical activity intervention. So for this study, we conducted a pilot study in a local here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, senior housing community. This was a pretty large unit here in Ann Arbor. It's 205 units with up to 250 residents living in it. It had 7 stories, 2 different towers. And we interviewed face-to-face 46 residents living in this community. And you can see here the characteristics of the community were similar to those that we found in the 3 communities in California, with 78% being female, and in terms of only 11% being married. So in this study, I was able to get many more in-depth measures of social relations, because that was at the heart of it. We wanted to see if we could systematically identify a group of socially engaged residents. So we asked residents to identify other people that they knew in the community. And from this list, then, the people that they identified as knowing, in other words, if they passed by us here in the hallway, could you tell me their name? We also asked them about how much they respect each of those people, how much time they spend with them, how much they confide in them, and then also how much they get on their nerves. Because again, we know relationships are both positive and negative. So I'm going to highlight here real briefly some of the descriptive findings from this study. So we found that on average, these 46 residents reported knowing 10 other residents. So again, imagine that 250 residents up to total live in this building, in this high rise. And on average, residents were reported as being known by 3 other residents. This is when a resident says, I know resident A. We then looked at how many times resident A was reported as being known by other residents. But we have to take that number with a little bit of caution, given that we were only able to interview 46 residents out of the 250. So we really only have a little bit of a snapshot of the community. We weren't able to get the response rate necessary to understand the whole network of the whole building and community. And then we moved on and look at those other characteristics. So among those people that people identified as knowing in the building, how much they respected them. So high levels of respect on the scale from 1 to 5. Kind of low levels of time spent. So people aren't spending that much time with each other in the building. Moderate levels of confiding in. So people might have a few numbers of people that they feel comfortable talking about important matters. And lastly, getting on nerves was pretty low, which seems to map on with the time spent, because there is some research that shows that more time you spend with somebody, the increased likelihood of people getting on your nerves. And then we also asked the question, which is, do you exercise with other residents here in this building? And we thought this number would be higher, but unfortunately it wasn't. So only 17% of the residents reported engaging in physical activity with other residents in the building. Again, this was from the mindset of us seeing if we could identify people who could be key movers of change to increase physical activity in this community. So this is another way of showing the results that I just showed you. And this was done through social network analysis, where we created what's called a sociogram of the social connections that we found through our survey. And what's shown here are the mutual ties. So in order for there to be a mutual tie, both people had to say they knew each other. So there's an arrow going out, there's an arrow going in. And first, highlighted in yellow, are people that we identified who we might classify as those potential influential agents of change in the community, who were above average on those mutual ties. So our socially engaged group, who we might involve in our future health behavior intervention. But then again, we had to cascade onto that. So again, if we're coming at it from the angle of physical activity, say that's the behavior we want to change. We thought we need to then understand and map onto this, is that person engaging in physical activity themselves? Because we wouldn't want a person to be a promoter of physical activity because they're so highly socially engaged, but they don't engage in physical activity themselves. So we then layered that onto this, where the boxes highlighted in yellow now are residents who are engaging in one or more moderate to vigorous physical activities in a typical week. And then the gray is people who are not engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity in a typical week. So we can see here now our potential population of 4 influential agents of change to involve in a future intervention goes from 4 to 2. So we'd have to look on the right. Those would probably be our key people that we would approach to invite to see if they would be involved in helping us promote within the community a physical activity intervention. A, because they looked on average above in terms of social engagement, and B, because they themselves are engaging in physical activity and could be a model of that behavior in which we want to intervene on. So one last thing I wanted to show you was that we also reanalyzed this data from a little bit less conservative approach. So again, that mutual ties approach assumes and requires that both people in that relationship say, yes, I know that person. But for the purpose of an intervention, we thought it could also be valuable if we relax that and just have the arrow going into the person. So in other words, that person was mentioned as being known by the other person. So these are what's called alter ties. And we see we get a much bigger population, where we get a larger number of ties known when we don't restrict it in 2 directions. Because we thought what really matters is that our key influential agents of change in the community really just need to be known so that the social contagion effects can take hold. And I highlighted in orange/yellow here, you can see the 2 people that we might particularly key in on. And they have, they're reported as being known by 9 of the 46 other people, or 5 in the other case. And then we have 1 highlighted in red who was known by a lot of people, but they're not engaging in physical activity, so they might not meet the criteria for this particular intervention. So what were our key takeaways from the study? The first was that more positive ties in lower income senior housing communities were linked to improvements in functional health among the residents over time. We also concluded that potential influential agents of change could be identified through systematic identification through social network analysis and survey research. And some of these residents actually engage in moderate to vigorous physical activity and could be involved in a future intervention. So our future direction in this work is to develop an intervention where we could actually leverage and utilize these influential agents of change. And we're currently doing 2 pilot studies located here in Ann Arbor with a remote physical activity intervention that's social network based. And there's evidence from these 2 pilot studies going on right now that there is social and physical activity impact. So we convened residents on Zoom, and we had them work with an occupational therapist. And then we had them learn about different activities, physical activities. And we also tried to seek to involve a socially engaged person at the heart of this to be part of our advisory committee for this. And one of our conclusions was that convening people who are living in the same proximate physical space on Zoom can have the potential to develop new ties. So for example, in our first pilot study, we did a random recruitment in a local senior housing community, but none of the people knew each other. So right there, then we couldn't from the outset leverage an existing person as an influencer of change. But by the end of our intervention, 4 out of the 5 people said that they knew each other. And 2 of the people had actually talked about going on and developing a walking group in the community. So while we didn't have the existing ties to leverage in this intervention, a subsequent intervention can build on the existing ties that we built through this intervention. Then actually in our second cohort, there was some already existing ties where the people knew each other, whereas 1 person didn't know each other, but by the end, they all 3 knew each other in our small cohort. But also a key indicator of success for us was that by the end, these 3 residents talked about forming a larger social network on site in the community to continue to engage in physical activity. So this was anecdotal evidence to us that there is feasibility in this approach and it could have the effect. So in future studies, we're going to do a larger scale studies with more communities and more residents. Okay. So now moving on to the second study highlight. So this is one that involves all 3 of those environments that I talked about. So the built and the natural, and this in particular looking at bioretention rain gardens. So these are built, but they're integrated with the natural environment. And the social aspect is our interactions with our neighbors. So this study is part of a larger collaboration. There's a whole list of collaborators, which I don't have time to go through, but included an advisory panel of folks working in Detroit. And then on the bottom right are a list of all the researchers who are involved here at the University of Michigan and also at Wayne State University. And I just want to highlight that the study was led by Joan Nassauer, who's at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And the larger name for the broader project was called Neighborhood Environment and Water Collaborations for Green Infrastructure. We called it NEWGI for short. So background in terms of stormwater. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the project, we probably all haven't thought too much about stormwater until it happens and there might be a flood in our neighborhood. And we might be seeing this more often due to climate change, because we're seeing an increase in what's called intense precipitation events. This is where we get more rainfall in a short amount of period of time than we have in the past. And our stormwater systems were designed for a different time, a different climate, when it could manage the amount of rainfall we were getting. And it can't handle to the same extent these more large rainfall events. And that's why we might see and hear about more flooding that happens after a big heavy rainfall. And then, for example, you might also be hearing about these more frequent 100-year storms. And you might be saying, wait a minute, we've heard about this 2 times in 5 years. Why are you calling them 100-year storms? That's because these projections used to be based on these longer term time models. So it requires more updating about what do we mean by a 100-year storm? And these changes can lead to greater risk of street flooding, basement backups, water damage, as well as environmental pollution through stormwater. So for example, in Detroit, they have what's called a combined sewer stormwater overflow. So during a big heavy rain event, the sewage and the stormwater intermingles and then is pumped out into nearby rivers. And this is a problem because in the past, the Environmental Protection Agency would monetarily fine municipalities and cities for the amount of overflows, combined sewer overflows they have during precipitation events. So there was a great monetary incentive for cities such as Detroit to address this. Another reason that we need to find solutions at the intersection of the natural and the built is because only built solutions, so gray infrastructure, that's concrete, that's redoing the pipes, et cetera, are too costly to solve this problem. So we need to look for alternative solutions. In green infrastructure, this is where we do the built integrated with the natural environment, could be a solution as well. So green infrastructure is distinct from other forms of greening. So you might hear about greening, for example, planting more trees or parks and things like that. So it's distinct because it has a specific purpose in its design and function, and that is specific to manage stormwater during heavy rainfall events. And it's built and integrated with the natural environment. And what it's designed to do is absorb the water. For example, when we get a big heavy rain that's coming down the street, it intakes it into a rain garden, and then it absorbs it into the ground at a more natural rate than would be done naturally and occurrently than it would if it was just rushing down the street, going into the pipes, then out into the rivers. In other words, these are bioretention gardens. Imagine them with a flowering garden on top. So when it's not a heavy rainfall, we see a beautiful garden, a flower garden with beautiful flowers and et cetera, with multiple colors. But on this project, we also sought to understand, so beyond the environmental impact that these gardens might have, can there be potential for co-benefits? Might there be opportunities for social benefits beyond the environmental impacts that it was designed to have about bringing in stormwater, absorbing it into the ground, keeping it from the rivers and the lakes? So we sought to investigate, for example, could it increase social interactions? Some other hypothesized mechanisms or social benefits of these rain gardens was reduced crime, reducing heat island effects, and also air pollution mitigation. So the aims of the overall project, this new GI project. So phase 1 was done in 2014 to 15, in which 4 gardens, pilot gardens, were installed in Southwest Detroit, in Detroit's Warrendale neighborhood. Then we conducted an initial census survey of the proximate residents living around the 4 garden sites. Then phase 2 was done in 2017 and 18, where the gardens were assessed in terms of their structural performance, operational, the water quality, et cetera. But we also did a resurvey of the residents living around them to understand the social impacts of living around these gardens, this landscape intervention. So the research question I asked as the social scientist involved on this project is, and also putting on a gerontology lens is there an association between the age of the resident living around one of these pilot garden sites and the perceived impact that it has on neighborhood block level scale, or the perceived impact it has on their neighborhood interactions? So in other words, how often they talk to their neighbors. So the data were from in-person interviews collected in 2017 to 18, about 134 residents participated. And the main measure we looked at was the outcome was, how has having this garden in your neighborhood impacted or changed the amount in which you interact with your neighbors, from decrease a lot to it increased a lot? And again, we looked at the age and how that predicted whether or not they experienced that increase. So here are the results. So what we found was a significant age effect. So at the heart of this, we sought to test 2 competing hypotheses. The first was, we thought older adults would benefit more socially from living around with these gardens, and coming at it from the perspective of that older adults might be retired and not working or living around the neighborhood environment more often. But on the other hand, we thought younger adults could also benefit potentially more from living around a garden such as this, in terms of bringing people out into the space, into the neighborhood, talking more, given that their social networks are still developing and forming, so they then might develop more interactions with their neighbors as well. But really, it was the hypothesis that older adults would benefit more was what we found. So we see here on average, people reported 3.6 on that scale of 1 to 5. So between no change to increased some in terms of living around these gardens in terms of its impact on interactions with neighbors. But we do see that the older adults did perceive that it had a greater effect on their interactions than did the younger adults. Because you see the mean is 3.8 for the older adults, age 60 and older, compared to 3.5 for the younger adults. So in the regression analysis, this was confirmed in that older adults were significantly perceived that it had significantly greater impact on their interaction with their neighbors. So our takeaways from this is that these bioretention gardens, again, at the heart of them and in their purpose is to manage urban stormwater during heavy precipitation events, which we're having more of, can also have social co-benefits. So again, this intersection between the social, the natural, and the built. And we can simultaneously address pressing challenges such as climate change, in this case, their primary goal, but we can also address social isolation in communities, in lower income communities that are dealing with social isolation, particularly older adults. This could also have a life course impact in thinking about it as older adults spending more time in their neighborhoods and their home as their activity space declines. And these gardens could have a potential impact on their quality of life, their well-being, and also their social well-being. So the next steps for the study involve looking at the specific design effects. So we also showed the residents who participated in the survey what the gardens could look like in the future to understand what are the features that we could tweak and adjust to get the maximal impact on their interactions with their neighbors. And we're also going to be exploring some of these design features in a subsequent project that we had funded recently from the National Science Foundation to do front yard garden plantings in suburban Cleveland. With this purpose of that is to help pollinator health, but at the same time, we're looking to see if we can have co-benefits of improving the social interactions among neighbors with that intervention. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the third and last study highlight. So this one again is at the intersection of all three of these environmental contexts that I'm seeking to highlight. So again, the built, the natural, and the social. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators on this, Madeline McLean, who's here in the room, as well as some colleagues from the School of Engineering, specifically civil and environmental engineering. In this study, we sought to understand the role of social capital in the coordination among dam operators along a river to promote watershed sustainability. So again, the built environment context in this case, in this study highlight is infrastructure. So I talked about at the beginning of the talk, how built infrastructure, so gray infrastructure, water-related infrastructure could be important built environment to think about. In this particular study, we looked at the dams along a river. So if we think about Argo Dam here in Ann Arbor or Barton Dam as particular examples. And also another piece of infrastructure that we're looking at in this study is sensors. So our engineering colleagues in the study have been deploying sensors all throughout the Huron River to monitor the level of the water, how fast the water is moving, et cetera. So that's another aspect of built infrastructure. In terms of the social, so this is the one aspect that we've been keying particularly on our social science team on this larger project is aspects such as reciprocity. How much do people in a social network feel that they want to help each other out? And thinking about trust, another key aspect of social capital. How much do people in a network or in a shared space trust each other? And also the social networks. What are the ties? What are the relationships between key actors in an environment, in this case, a watershed? In the natural environment, we are thinking and looking at how the intersection between these built and social aspects would influence the natural environment, in this case, the health of the Huron River or the Huron River watershed. So just real briefly, what is a watershed? And I mistakenly didn't know what it was to the full extent until I worked on this project, or I couldn't define it very well. So I wanted to define it for you all, and I'm sure some of you already know what it is. But a watershed is an area of land that drains all the streams and rainfall to a common outlet, such as the outflow of a reservoir, mouth of a bay, or any point along a stream or channel. So this shows a picture of a watershed. In this particular case, the built environment infrastructure that we're interested in. So the sensors deployed along the river, but throughout the watershed, and then also the dams. Then I also highlighted the particular study context for this study was the Huron River watershed. So some key facts about this watershed, so which we're located in, I circled in black there, where we are here in Ann Arbor in the watershed. So it spans over 800 square miles. And it's home to nearly 60 different communities, 30 of which are located directly on the river. It includes over 700,000 residents all along in the watershed. And also included along the Huron River and in the watershed more broadly are 20 dams that are actively managed and controlled. So some of these dams are located on what's called the main stem of the river. That's if you were to go to Argo and you go kayaking, think of that as the main stem. But there's some inland lakes that are off the main stem, and there's dams on those as well that are being managed and controlled. So why is this topic of importance? So we know that communities, as I mentioned, there's a whole host of communities that are in the Huron River watershed. So many of these communities are facing unprecedented water-related challenges. This is due to aging infrastructure. So again, the infrastructure is many years old, and in some cases designed for different climate, that when we are getting different precipitation. And also increasing flooding related to this increasing precipitation events, runoff pollution, et cetera, things I talked about earlier with that first study highlight. And these again are exacerbated in many ways due to ongoing climate change. And then the water managers, the people who have to manage these, are often carry their decisions out or making decisions in locally isolated vacuums. So an example of a water manager is a dam operator. So if we think about somebody who actually does the levers and the controls or programming at a local dam like Argo or Barton Dam, these people are often making decisions thinking about, if I make this decision or make this adjustment or make this decision, how's it going to affect locally nearby? And currently, in this current state, the operators have limited ability to contextualize how their decisions and their actions could negatively affect the whole watershed. So if they're thinking in the vacuum or just in the proximate area, if I release my dam, it's going to affect just this local area, what I can see, but how might it affect the whole watershed? So an example is, for example, operators, like we get a big heavy rainfall event, and an operator at a particular dam might release water via the dam very quickly because they're worried about getting a bunch of angry phone calls from some local landowners that the lake levels are too high, and therefore they need to release it immediately. But they might make that decision or do that action without any understanding or consideration for what might happen downstream, because this is a river, so the water from upstream goes downstream. So making these decisions in a locally isolated vacuum do have impacts downstream. So for example, some of the negative impacts environmentally include it stirs up sediment when water is released too quickly and the flow increases and is too high. And this increasing of sediment at the bottom, the bottom of the river, it leads to flooding and erosion downstream. It could also have negative impacts on the residents as well as fish populations. So for example, in the Huron River, it's the bass populations that I've learned about that they need a particular flow level that needs to be maintained in order for the healthy flourishing of the population. And also water quality, and stirring up the sediment increases pollution. And here our water source is the Huron River. So this could potentially affect negatively the water supply. So the broader question that the larger project with our colleagues in engineering sought to address is to facilitate greater coordination in water flows via a web-based decision support tool for the operators, these water managers, to help reduce the negative impacts on the environment, many of which are exacerbated by climate change. So the social science knowledge gap that we were specifically trying to help address is we don't currently understand the role of social capital within this network of dam operators that are working all along and in the Huron River watershed. And by social capital, I mean trust in each other, their social networks and communication, also the norms of reciprocity about helping each other out. And we don't understand how this social capital plays a role in the decision-making process, in particular as it relates to flow management and decisions related to that. And then ultimately, the goal is to incorporate that social science knowledge, gaps on social capital, into this decision support tool that our engineering colleagues are developing. So in other words, what features could be incorporated to further facilitate greater social capital? Is there communication features that could be embedded into this decision support tool that currently is looking to incorporate the sensor data and present it to the people, but also we see it as an opportunity to build further social capital through technology. So the two specific questions we looked at in our social science team is, what is the role of social capital in the context of a network of dam operators, and specifically locally here in the Huron River watershed? And another question that we layered onto this, because we received support for this project through the ISR College of Engineering Rural Context Program, is, does this vary by rural versus urban context in terms of the operators and the social capital available? Because many of the dams and the operators working are across a wide range of rural urban contexts across our watershed here. So in the past, my colleague in engineering, Branko Kirkas, has been working for over 10 years with colleagues here in the Huron River watershed to deploy a whole sensor network. And this is the infrastructure I talked about earlier. So they've been deploying these sensors off of bridges and different places that monitor both the water levels as well as the flow of the river. So they can tell how specific decisions that are made are impacting both these two aspects, both the level and the flow. So currently what we did in 2004, at the late 2024, was conduct 10 semi-structured interviews among operators and other people working in the watershed management here locally. And then we conducted grounded theory analysis and thematic analysis with these data. Just highlighted here are the some descriptors of the 10 people that we talked to. And as you can see, we talked to quite a few people with quite a range across the Huron River watershed, and they vary quite a bit in their different roles. So we talked to 3 people at the top you see who are specifically the people changing those levers, were making day-to-day the operations of the dam, or making those decisions to release water, how much, and when. And then some other people who are at the project manager stage who might not have been doing the day-to-day stuff, but were influencing those decisions. So there were 3 themes that I want to highlight that came about as it relates to social capital. And the 3 are norms of reciprocity. So in other words, there was a sense of collaboration, helping other operators out in the watershed without an immediate sense of getting personal gain. And then there was the social responsibility, and this was specifically keyed into the impact of residents. So a sense of duty of the operator for thinking and working about residents. So in other words, how would their actions or the decisions relieve local residents' concerns and worries, whether it's after a big heavy rainfall or event, how might it impact their well-being? And also, we think about this third element of social capital of trust. We found actually some perceptions of distrust in the network, in the community. This was a mismatch when there was between perceived legal constraints, because one barrier that I didn't have much time to get into is that there's what's called state lake levels, where it's mandated by the state what certain lake levels have to be. So some of the operators are constrained by those legal state requirements. But there was a mismatch in trust for maybe a downstream operator in terms of what they were seeing from flows upstream, thinking that maybe those legal requirements were not always being met by their partners and these other operators throughout the network. So some key quotes I wanted to show you real briefly for each of these themes that I'll just read real quickly. So the first on the norm of reciprocity, and this is an illustrative quote we found from these 10 interviews, which was this particular structure that I was saying that we contact them, it's a little older and it's harder for them to get the boards out and manage it. So I'm gonna pause there right for a second. So another thing we've been learning about in our social science work in the network is there's quite a variation in terms of the infrastructure. So if we think about Barton and Argo Dam, those are complicated dams that are automated, have controls, et cetera. But some of these dams that are in rural areas, they have a board. It's physically a piece of lumber that goes into a set of slots that controls the levels of the lake and controls the flow. So the person, the operator in this case, might be a part-time operator who physically grabs the board, lifts it out, and that's how they change the water levels, which varies drastically from somebody who might be working at Barton or Argo, who's controlling things, getting measurements, et cetera. So to continue on with the quote, so it's a privately owned dam, so it's more important to give them the heads up, to give them the time to prep. You know, if it's a mechanical type change or it's something that's easier to get the boards out or whatever, the control mechanism is maybe it's not a big deal. So thinking about, this is a person talking about their norm of reciprocity and giving a fellow operator a little bit more heads up because they know about their constraints of their infrastructure. In terms of social responsibility, this quote is, it's best to get the residents involved early. Residents need to understand what's going on, why you might be doing something and what the goal of doing it is. So again, these are the decision-making processes of an operator. Once you have the residents support it, it really comes down to the inner workings between the entities that are involved, but what works best is when you're doing things that are driven up from the residents. Again, this is a sense of social responsibility of the operators to the residents that they're serving or that their dam is serving. In terms of distrust, the last theme that we found in terms of social capital is they're all supposed to. So this is an operator talking about, thinking about other operators in the network. So they're all supposed to run of the river. But either they don't do that or their capabilities of their dam are so limited that the dam doesn't allow them to do it properly. So they had some mistrust in their other operators, whether it's them making conscious decisions to not uphold these regulations or just their aging infrastructure wasn't allowing them to do that. So one thing I want to also highlight, given our focus and the diverse set of operators we talked with, and also across the watershed that spans rural to urban environments, we want to look at some differences across these 2 different types of operators. So we found that our rural operators more relied on communication with each other, and that they also took manual flow measurements. So they were not likely to have sensors or access to resources or equipment to do this. But the urban operators, those were the ones who perceived more distrust, and often some distrust in their rural colleagues and rural operators, and that they were mistrusting that the flows were getting outside of the legal limits that they were observing as a result of decisions coming upstream. And also these urban operators had access to more precise measurements via more funding for sensors or potentially collaborations with colleagues at the University of Michigan, for example. So some future directions for this work. So what I presented here is the early stages. We're doing the qualitative stage. And we're planning to do additional interviews across the Huron River watershed to get a greater sampling of operators across this rural-urban continuum, and also decision makers at the state level, as well as people working in the Huron River watershed more broadly. And our next step after that is to do a survey of the operators to map their social networks. So thinking back to that first example I highlighted of the senior housing community, where we map the ties, who knows who talks to who and how often and how much they respect each other, we're gonna apply those same methods to the dam operators. Because we wanna map who's talking to who, what are they talking about, how are they talking with each other? Because thinking about all that information could go into the web decision support tool. Because if we learn that people prefer to text with one of the other operators, could that feature be built into the decision support tool that my colleagues in engineering are developing? And we're also planning to expand to other watersheds here in the state of Michigan and also beyond that might have different contexts. So for example, we have one of the most engaged watershed councils in the country here with our Huron River Watershed Council. Not all watersheds have that. So in particular, might our network of operators be more networked because of our local resource. And then, as I mentioned, our engineering colleagues are actively building this web decision support tool that integrates the sensor data and is presenting it to the operators. But again, we want to make this tool more effective at building the social capital in the watershed. And lastly, then, we hope to work with our colleagues in engineering. We're planning to conduct focus groups to get feedback on their decision support tool so we can make their engineering solution more useful and usable at the end. So with that, I just want to say thank you for your attention. I look forward to any comments and thoughts.
We'll take questions now, and we'll come around with a microphone. If you don't mind raising your hand, we'll come to you.
Thanks, Noah. I really appreciate it hearing the talk and all the different projects. I'm curious about when you were speaking about design in particular, and I work in College of Architecture and Urban Planning, and so there's a pretty high premium on the role of design in shaping and helping support different kinds of interactions, particularly pro-social ones, I would say, ones that are cooperative or create certain kinds of experiences. And I'm interested in some of your thoughts about how we begin to characterize sort of the impact of design and measure that. And there has been some increased interest, particularly I think in starting to do more randomized controlled trials to some extent around interventions, specifically from the approach of design and thinking about different different shapes of design, the different sort of intentionality that goes behind that. And, you know, I'm wondering, reflecting on some of your work, particularly in the senior housing and things like that, that degree of intentionality is sort of maybe a key aspect of it, and sort of how it brings out some of the experiences that we're aiming for. So I'd love just your thoughts on sort of what the future looks like as you think about the role of design in this.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So maybe thinking about it in the particular case of the senior housing project. So we came at that project through thinking about social theory, what we know about social relationships, about how and why they're important, and can we hypothesize the specific aspects that we think might play a role in moving the needle, in particular as it relates to health behaviors in this particular context, so among older adults living in lower income housing. So we sought to bring a priori set of constructs, so like the people who are known by the most others, like respect, being respected by others in your community, how that might relate to you being a key agent of change in your community. So thinking about that from the outset. And then just along the stage of design and thinking about an intervention design, doing that whole stage of continuum of work. So starting off with a pilot feasibility study. So the results I presented were from a local pilot feasibility study. Could we identify those local agents of change? And once we answer that question, yes, now we're going to move on to that next stage of seeing is the intervention effective when we're doing it? And then, like you mentioned and highlighted, the role of randomized controlled trials, often the gold standard of seeing if an intervention or design approach is effective at achieving its desired outcome. So that's where we hope that work will go. But I want to transition and talk a little bit about the other design project, where myself as the social scientist, I'm trained as a sociologist, was involved in a very multidisciplinary team. So I want to highlight the Urban Rain Gardens in Detroit project. So that was led by a landscape designer who was very intentional about the rain gardens, how they looked, what their function was. And so I had very key expectations and hypotheses about those. So as my colleague Joan Nassauer, who developed a theory called cues to care. So how we can embed cues in landscapes to affect how people perceive them and then react to them and experience them. So that was at the heart of that work. And then my role as a social scientist was working with the design team to help evaluate the social co-benefits. So again, there was a whole other set of members on the project team who were helping to evaluate the natural environmental impacts, but we really wanted to evaluate the social co-benefits of the very intentionality that went into the design of those gardens, how they looked, what were the plants chosen, how tall are they, how might the specific demographic of the population where they're going to be embedded perceive them, the norms of those communities, et cetera, and that intentionality. And then 100% agree with your suggestion about what needs to happen next to really determine effectiveness of that is the randomized control trials. So we're looking to do that very activity in that project I alluded to very quickly, which is happening in suburban Cleveland, where we're developing front yard garden plantings. So these are going to be small gardens that you would view. So if you're walking down a sidewalk and you see somebody's garden, you see their front yard. So we're installing these in 40 yards in Cleveland, and then we're going to have control sites that don't get into gardens. So I have a colleague who's an entomologist on the project who's studying the impact of these gardens on the bee population, but we're also surveying the residents living around these in varying degrees of distance from the gardens to see if living in a garden site versus a non-garden site is having that impact. So yeah, 100% agree that we need those collaborations across disciplines to help understand a range of the benefits, whether it's environmental benefits, such as my colleague looking at the impacts on bee health, the social scientists looking at social interactions, such as my sub-team, and then the designers who are bringing that informed a priori understanding about the way the world works and working together. So thanks for that question.